So today we're going to talk about the human nature question and socialism and the challenge that some people offer. Show of hands, how many of you have heard from many people the statements, socialism cannot work because of human nature, socialism works on paper, it's not possible in reality, or socialism is utopian. Okay. And then show of hands, how many of you still feel that way? We don't have any new people here, so I'm not worried. We had a few young college students from Howard who are still not necessarily socialists, who I think might put their heads up. But anyway, people who propose that socialism is not compatible with human nature or vice versa are actually, I think, saying that humans are dominated by our worst features, selfishness, capriciousness, competitiveness, and greed. And this is probably the most common challenge we face as socialists. But then it rolls off of people's tongues like it's common sense, like everybody should know this thing that human nature, we're inherently selfish and competitive because of our human nature. And so we should wonder as socialists where this notion came from and how did it give rise to this level of common sense. People speak of it as if it's an unquestionable fact. So as socialists, we should also answer these questions, especially if we want to grow in size and strength, because we always get people on the table that ask us these types of questions. If you ask free market capitalists, of course, they'll say, oh, we have a biological imperative to behave in a way that's perfectly suited for the free market. There's an economist, Matt actually introduced me to him, Michael Albert, who sums it up. He talks about how you don't barter soup at the dinner table at home. You don't tell your 2-year-old, you don't get food tonight because you didn't bring the $2 that would be the cost of your food. So, but then in society, there is a drive for us to be competitive, and that drive is actually created by the market system. So in a market economy, if you behave in any way that's not the market way, which is, if you're non-competitive, then you just lose. You don't get to keep up. So when we behave according to market rules and what it dictates, it's made to seem as if it's in our genes somehow, that it's some kind of intrinsic quality of humans to compete using these modern market forces. But human beings are, after all, a part of the natural world. So we do have a nature, and what determines our nature substantially is our genetic endowment, environmental conditions, and also just laws of science or laws of nature like gravity and things like that. So any inquiry into how biological organisms behave, in humans being biological organisms, should take all of these things into account. But then you can't exactly test much as far as our genetic endowment goes, because we don't allow experimentation on humans, because we have some ethics concerns around those. But it's really complicated. It's hard to even understand a whole lot about even simple organisms like insects, where we have no restrictions as far as testing them, let alone understand human genetics. There is a field of evolutionary psychology that's growing, and this field tries to use evolutionary theory to understand fundamental human nature. But even this field is handicapped by the fact that you can't really run scientific experiments on humans from the bygone era, humans from 200,000 years ago. So it's not very easy to just try to sort of empirically or through experiments determine what our human nature might be. So our knowledge as human beings and our knowledge of human beings has to come from our understanding of history, literary exploration, just our overall experiences and so on. So if it's not that clear or easy to determine what our nature is, at least not via experimentation, then how can we say if we are inherently good or bad? How do we know if we're inherently suited better for one system than another? So that would be one of the first things we should tell non-socialists who ask us this question. Now, on the surface, we're very different from each other. We look different, we speak different languages, our food is different. But then right below the surface, we have this enormous uniformity. We are, some people are...
Am I late?
No, we just started talking about human nature and socialism, but I'm just going to continue. I just got to a very little. So I was saying, on the surface, human beings are very different from one another. We speak different languages, we eat different food, but then we have this tremendous amount of uniformity, right? Like below the surface. We all have the ability for language or communication. We all need to eat to survive. We all need to have sex to reproduce. So even though on the surface there's this wide range of possibilities, some people can be nasty, some people can be very nice, some people may sacrifice their lives for puppies. Even these insane amount of possibilities are simply not enough to prove that there is one common thread in which we behave, whether it's altruistic or selfish. So each person can be good or bad depending on the environment we're thrown into. Even today, there are societies, if we go looking, that can provide us a glimpse into a life that's very different from modern capitalism, even with all its cultural variants. In such societies, which today are often untouched by modern humans, competition does not rule, and people who obtain food will share it equally with everyone else. And childcare is not just the job of the women or even one woman. It's a job that may be shared by men too, even those men who are not fathers. Marx and Engels call this the epoch of primitive communism. And of course, we may think, or people who are dismissive of this may think, oh, primitive communism, there's the word primitive in there, it's only probably possible in some kind of simple, rudimentary society. A famous philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, defined this period of humanity as one in which individuals were just nasty and brutish, and then this is not a good or a desirable way for a complex industrialized world to be structured. Now, Western academics who studied pre-capitalist societies up until the 20s and the 30s paid attention to what was different about primitive societies, and that difference was that they were egalitarian, and so they echoed what Marx had said all along. But in the 50s, this trend started to shift towards stressing what academics had in common with capitalists, which was and religion also played a role. So the dominant narrative around that time became that it's the way the society was structured then was the way we just have to be. So you've heard that people were told, or the priests told people, the kings were sent by God to take care of the subjects. Even though there was an antagonistic relationship between the subjects and the king, it just made it seem like that's just the way it is. Someone gets to rule, someone else gets to follow. Chris Harman, who wrote the book People's History of the World, also wrote an essay called Artificial Human Nature in 2007. And this is what he says. He says, hierarchy, inequality, and male supremacy were all said to be universal attributes in that time. Those who claimed humans had once lived in egalitarian societies, that is primitive communism, were treated as dogmatic throwbacks to a long superseded unscientific approach. Any attempt to trace the evolution of different patterns of human behavior over tens of thousands of human history was ruled out. This erasure fitted in with the ideological climate created by McCarthyism in the US and the role of modern British anthropology as a handmaiden to colonialism. So to maintain the narratives of imperialism, to maintain the narratives of colonialism, we were just told by the ruling class, in order to maintain their interests and protect their own position, that's just the way it was. It's human nature. Some people get to keep more, some people get to have less. Of course, in the 60s and 70s, we saw people started to reject war and American imperialism and racism. The civil rights movement happened. So more and more academic figures started to produce studies of these hunter-gatherer societies or foraging societies that showed that these primitive societies were in fact based on sharing, and they lacked any kind of hierarchy of class or gender or power. These conclusions were very, very important because for hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived by being hunters-gatherers. And then for less than 200 years, we had capitalism. So 95% of the time that human beings have existed, there has been an egalitarian society, and then the last 200 years, so about 5%, not so much. So, but what this does though, that these studies and these conclusions, it helps to give an overall outline of human development. So it started to show that you could link relationships humans have with each other based on how they make a livelihood. And who gets to be boss, who gets to be an employee, who owns, who produces. And this was first suggested by Marx and Engels in the German ideology in the 1840s. It's very important because Marx was able to tie back our relationship to one another and then overall to the society and to nature through economics. He called it the material conception of history, that is, the laws of history are economic in nature. And then he also said there is an economic base of society, its economic organization and everything else that supports the economic order, he called the superstructure. So some people actually think that Karl Marx rejected the notion of human nature, but that's not true. What he rejected was there was some kind of abstract, eternal human essence or human spirit that existed outside of the society. So Marx always said that human nature is mediated through the society, and it's expressed in different ways within a society and then across a society. Most importantly, the position he held was that we produce things, right? We use our labor, and fundamentally we're able to alter our environment using our labor, and we are the only species that can do that, right? Animals, they have a life activity, but their life activity is not separate from them. So a cat only knows to survive, eat, survive really. But human beings have a conscious life activity, which means we can use our consciousness to think about ourselves, think about people, think about the world, and we can make plans for the future. We can reflect on the past events. The laboring aspect of our nature is what Marx called species being in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, which apparently were not published until well after World War II. So many academics had already decided what their position on Marx would be, or Marx's position on human nature. So this consciousness that human beings have allows us to use our capacity in creative and self-directed manners, so we can satisfy our desires to do anything. You don't want to be hungry, you can fix that. You want to make a beautiful statue or build this library, we are able to do that. I mean, in theory anyway. So if we could go back in time and ask a 15th century peasant, or my great-great-grandma who lived under the rule of the king, and if we asked them about human nature or slavery or bonded work, they'll probably say, well, that's just the way it is. That's just human nature. Some people have to be slaves, some people have to work, do bonded labor. But through the course of struggle, we know that this common sense notion of human nature has been stripped away. Like today, we all know that it's totally contrary to human spirit to involve in slavery. We know that slavery is not right. And I really think that post-revolution, we will say the same things about capitalism. We may say, oh, wage labor, wow, that's a thing of the past, who does that? And I really, really believe that. So we have to remember, for 95% of all human existence, our nature hasn't been characterized by all these things people ascribe to it. So we really can't blame our present-day problems on just human nature. Just telling this story, I think, will challenge people on this narrative that capitalism is conducive to human nature and socialism isn't. Marx observed that under capitalism, human productivity and productive capacity has increased so much that for the first time in history, it is possible to have enough of everything for everybody. And we've also seen that if individuals try to succeed, the system is rigged against us. Through labor movement, we've seen that when we collectively work together, we have so much more gains. Not to mention, sure, we're motivated by money. We all like money. Money helps us buy things. But we're also motivated to be altruistic and to volunteer. I mean, look at how regular people have come together to respond to the hurricanes recently. So if we could harness modern technology, we can really provide for everyone through socialism. And I think it's our shared nature, so it's something we actually all share, that will help us build these values of a just society. Instead of a society that currently rewards only vicious and greedy people, our socialist society would help us develop a new culture which would be more just and based on equality. And then, if through that we could shorten the workday, because we have this immense productive capacity, we could pursue so much creative work and so much, so many intellectual endeavors, which would be valuable, and then just totally unleash our vast potential. I found something from Howard Zinn, and I'll close with this quote. If those in charge of our society, politicians, corporate executives, and owners of press and television can dominate our ideas, they'll be secure in their power. They will not need soldiers patrolling the streets. We'll control ourselves. So we have to fight that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I liked your timeline idea, because I think it's a short, specific way to, when you're talking to people on the street, to be like, you know, for the majority of human history, we've lived in these egalitarian societies. I'm just wondering if maybe it's more, not exactly accurate, just more nuanced to talk about it in terms of class division. So we lived, up until really period of slavery, we lived in classless society, rather than think of it as non-capitalism and capitalism. I don't know, that's just...
No, it makes sense, yeah. So I think it's what, 15,000 years? So Neolithic revolution.
Yeah, Neolithic revolution, where the administrative class kind of started to emerge. But without, like, when we're talking to people, we can't really go into like a huge history lesson with them. But I like the timeline idea. I think it's...
No, but it makes sense, because one of the questions I expected to get asked, especially by someone not familiar with socialism, is how do you know? How do you know when for how long we did what? And so the evidence only exists since the beginning of the Neolithic revolution. Once we had to settle down and we were agricultural societies, that's the only time we needed to, have, so produce, and then there would be scarcity, we had to address the scarcity we overproduced. So, but good point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the beginning of capitalism was when the cavemen hit the woman over the head and drag her. You know that old, like, cartoon kind of character?
Very scientific.
Yeah. Anyway, that wasn't what I wanted to say. That wasn't that thing. So I had two things. One, definitely a great lead-off and a very interesting subject I really like this. So I was reading something a while back about worker cooperatives, and they were talking about how it's more in line with like human nature, and it was written, I think, by like biologists, evolutionary biologists, and the example they used was that in hunter-gatherer societies, if you had found food, say you found like a dead deer or whatever, a bear or something, if somebody just walked up and started taking it all, they would have been kicked out of the group and they would have been alone. So there was kind of this, an evolutionary advantage to wanting to share, wanting to do things out evenly. So that's interesting to look at. And also, this kind of ties into it, and I think it's a good opportunity to kind of dive into it. For the day school, when I did my lead off on Marxist economics, I totally forgot to do one part of it. And it is the idea, because a lot of people will tell you, you say, well, it's counter to like human nature, we're not really competitive, it's a hierarchy. They'll say, well, markets are democratic. That's one of the things they'll say. And there's something I wanted to explain. I wanted to kind of so like if you take an economics course, now I'll use the exact example they used when I took economics, is that they'll say, well, if you're in a college town, there's a pizza place in this college town, and they sell their pizzas for $10, pizza, and what you say, 100 people would like to buy it at $10, right? And that, in their view, so that's like them, people saying, we want these resources to be used towards 100 pizzas at that price. And then they'll say, well, if they raise it to 15, let's say nobody wants to, just for simplification, no one wants to buy it. And that's the market's way of saying we want those resources to be used for something else, right? So you look at it and go, oh yeah, I guess you kind of have a point. But it's so simple. It's like, what if Joe, the billionaire, shows up? And he's like, I want 100 pizzas at $15 a pop, right? And then the resources get used to the pizzas, which everybody rejected, according to this so-called free market thing. So that's not democracy. That's like, it's kind of a ridiculous concept.
Have you read, I'm sorry, but just talking on that topic, have you read Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century?
I have not. I've heard about it, but yeah.
He expounds on that point in some detail, and he goes on to say how, the transformation of capitalism in America from wealth that has some utility to wealth that is merely stored as excess financial products or resources actually has a detrimental impact on capitalism, on free democracy.
Yeah, so he's talking about the financial stuff?
Yeah, but also in general, the transference of wealth out of cycles that are connected with actual production.
Yeah.
It's
So
continuing
that's
wealth
the,
creation, so it's like
that's-
just phantom money.
that's the financial sector kind of sucking that production dry, which is what's been happening. Yeah, that's totally on that. Yeah, it's a-
Have you read
that's-
Piketty's book? It's huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a close friend who actually attended a lecture he gave at UC Santa Cruz
Mm.
and said that he was, terrifyingly erudite and brilliant in both English and French.
Really?
Yeah, so
Mm.
he has a really, I think he teaches at the Sorbonne, but I'm not sure. He has a really formidable reputation.
Yeah.
And it is, I wanted to try and read it in the French, but mine's not quite that technical.
Mm.
So I couldn't, but he has a lot of very valid points.
Yeah.
There's an economist that expands on that. His sole focus is on that. It's Michael Hudson. I don't know if you've heard of him. But Michael Hudson's whole thing is that the financial industry is sucking everything dry. I guess you went to school for economics and then you got a job working with the central bank. And they were like, no, everything you learned in economics, just forget it. Like, you do something different. You realize that the math, that they don't teach math in economics because it doesn't work. But anyway,
Yeah.
if you're interested in learning more about it, definitely check out him.
Lido.
But, yeah. If I want to work into it.
Right.
Yeah.
I just have a short comment, but I'll probably say more once I think of stuff. But the comment is, I really loved your lead off and what you said, but I found myself wanting to change the wording to corruption. So the thing that I struggle with is corruption or corruptibility, or the desire to hoard. Is that human nature? So I was listening to what you were saying, and wherever you were saying competition or whatever, I was transferring the word corruption in there and seeing if it changed it.
Yeah, I
somehow.
included capriciousness, which is, I think, avarice, those things are,
Yeah.
You are able to be corrupted, sorry.
Because it kind of then it was taking the negative behavior element and saying, how does that behavior come into play in any kind of economic or societal system? So what's really the root cause there? What is the opposite of the behavior where the most people benefit? Something like that.
Yeah, but I think we have a society that will reward corrupt people. Like that's because
Donald Trump.
Yeah, or like countries like India, where if you're corrupt, you actually not only accumulate wealth, but you also get much farther ahead than someone who won't play by those rules. I'll use a personal anecdote. My mother has a master's degree in civil engineering, and she was due for a promotion, and they asked her for it's Indian money, 1 million rupees, which is not a lot. You have to divide by 67 for US dollars, but still, she refused, and she didn't get the promotion. Someone else who offered to pay the money.
Mhm.
So I think even just on a personal level, there was she couldn't get ahead. But I think corruption fits in with selfishness and other, so the bad qualities are rewarded, and in an egalitarian society we could make it so that there would be no reward for being corrupt, and so then we wouldn't have the incentive to behave poorly.
One of the wonderful things about there being a resurgence of interest in Ayn Rand is that people are talking about, societies in which there's no clear moral barometer, where all values are fungible assets and all human relationships are contractual. So I think that gives a great example of, late period Trump-style capitalism taken to its point of logical exhaustion, and the need to craft a new society based on egalitarian principles that have nothing to do with, predatory capitalism.
The key word there being principles. The idea that there are some things that aren't fungible. That is the Randian or postmodern idea that it's all just sort of relative.
Right.
And that when you said egalitarian principles, meaning that they are fundamental pillars of a new society, I think that's key to have those kind of principles.
I think the ontological sort of notion that there are a priori principles is well rooted in America. I mean, we're living in a city that has monuments to principles.
Sure.
I think the grounding is there. You know, I think it's part of our intellectual fabric.
Yeah.
But I think also that same receptivity to new ideas and to the fact of ideas has also made us, I think, inflexible in some ways, increasingly ossified in our perceptions of I guess, political reality. So it's really interesting.
I hear myself on stack. As far as, I just want to quickly address the corruption, or at least give my own anecdote as well. My whole family is from Ghana. And as far as a developing country goes, it's pretty good, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, it's like, oh, Ghana's, doing relatively well, but there is corruption. I mean, all over. I mean, people are always trying to like charge you more for stuff. The cops always want money for something. Politicians, I mean, even to get my internship, I had to give the guy money. And so, yes, like this corruption will happen, and we have a society that sometimes rewards corruption as well, but like it also creates this stagnation that people get really tired of. And so, yes, it does help to keep things going. And sometimes that is the only way you can get ahead, if you involve yourself in the corruption. But I think overall, it still creates this stagnation. I mean, Ghana could be way more ahead. Like my father, for example, he has a few properties there, and he's been building a house there for years. And it's just been going slow because you give somebody money and they take a bunch of it and they barely do the work. And I mean, there's the ripple effect that has in society, and the distrust that creates with amongst each other in society, and the social capital, the way that's reduced when there is so much corruption. I mean, yes, we do have a society that rewards that, but I think on the overall, it's like a huge hindrance. That's clear. But that wasn't my main point. As far as this human nature and this competition that's just supposed to be inherent in our human nature. I mean, not only do we see that that's not true in like traumatic events like Hurricane Irma, but really just in our everyday life, which is why I think it's such a stupid argument. That's not the nicest word. But because we have to be egalitarian and collective all the time in order to make anything happen. In fact, the capitalists depend on that. I mean, just your everyday, like regular mundane shit, like everybody having to, work collectively just to get to work safely. But then also within the workplace, your boss absolutely relies on you not being competitive with your other coworkers. Competitive to a point where like you don't tell each other your salary, or you just assume that the women or the black people in your workplace ain't shit, and so you like, whatever kind of internal conflict happens there. But at the end of the day, if we were always competing with each other, then things would never get done. So it's just a dumb, well, I mean, keep saying that it's dumb, but it's contradicted in our everyday life. In order for anything to happen, that we have to have this collective kind of nature about us. Competition is useful only for the bosses or for the ruling class, and it's only applied where they need it. But if we're not being collective in other ways, then Kevin.
Just to comment on that too, I think that's a very good example of how Marx said that that capitalism has produced its own gravedigger, like in the sense that the working class has to work together. The working people have to make sure that when they work together. There is a disconnect in terms of a group of people in society who though they depend on that collective labor, aren't participating in it at all, and yet they're receiving those benefits. And so those are the people who think that the idea of like a sort of collective idea is impossible, where the working class knows it by their work. And so it's sort of an example of how capitalism itself, in the creation of this urban, industrialized working class that does everything, it creates the conditions by which the system of that massive inequality in terms of who owns it can be defeated, because it's created its own.
Right.
It's created its own destructive force.
Right.
So
We know we're working with each other. I mean, we have to do it. We have the power to do that.
But then on the issue of human nature, I mean, having argued for socialism for as many years as I have, it's an argument that you hear constantly. And it's in some ways oddly the most persuasive, which I find amazing. Like people can just, oh, I'm not a socialist because, human nature, duh. And I think that it's really frustrating because if you really look into what human nature is and means, and it's the idea of like what is every human being reducible to? That's really what it means. What are we at the base? And if you think about that, what we are African apes. So we have an evolutionary heritage that goes all the way down the evolutionary chain to the first life until now. And in that whole history, there is, which I think is represented in what it has produced in humanity is an incredibly intelligent, labor able, and so you can plan, you can institute that labor, but it also allows you to adapt. Human beings are the only species, one of the only species, I guess there's probably some insect species or something, but one of the only larger species that can exist everywhere on the planet. Not based on its mere evolutionary genetic ability, but because of its intellectual ability and its ability to manipulate its environment.
So that's cockroaches, but okay.
Yeah, but a cockroach should do it because of who they are, not necessarily because of what they build to protect themselves. So it's a different kind of context. But I take your point. But and so what that means is that adaptability is really just our ability to turn on and off all of those features of our evolutionary heritage. So, does that evolutionary heritage include the ability to be capricious? Yeah. To be greedy? Yeah. To commit acts of genocide? Yeah. That is a part of all of us. But so too is our ability to work together, to care about each other, to sacrifice our lives for people that aren't our family. There's also very few species who will do that, who will protect someone who isn't related to them by blood. And so I think that because the knowledge of our evolutionary past and the good and bad parts of it, the ability for us to adapt to damn near any situation we can find on this planet, means that the societies that we live in, essentially we're incentive seeking, like you said, in the sense that we can create a system that incentivizes us to turn on or off these evolutionary triggers or switches in our genetic code. And we live in a society now that triggers some of the worst forms of us. And Marx in the manifesto admits that there is some benefit to that. There is some benefit to turning on these engines of capriciousness or selfishness. That there can be benefits to it, but that isn't unlimited. And that there also is a time and a place to reconnect ourselves to the basic, to our basic formations, which is that primitive communism. Is that the idea that once we have enough resources to take care of enough people, which capitalism is a system of crisis because of overproduction, then we can reignite the sort of evolutionary traits of real human solidarity, real sort of altruism and solidarity and these ideas. And the engine of capitalism in terms of what it's able to construct is running out of steam. And so there was the necessity for these kinds of terrible things no longer has any utility. And so we are seeing its final conclusions, I think. But also very good lead up.
Yes, it was a very good lead up. Matt went to the bathroom, so we'll skip him real quick and go to Matthew.
All right. So my point goes right along with yours. I was thinking about another very base element of our human nature is with animals, especially taking a Skinner perspective of reinforcement and punishment. So we live in a system now where these negative traits are rewarded and anything that goes against it is punished. So in theory, if we overturn the reinforcer and the punisher to reinforce egalitarianism and punish selfishness, you can kind of see where if things are flipped on its head, we'll act in our best for everyone. So yeah, I like that idea of the base evolutionary kind of it's kind of too simplified in some ways, but I think it's a good way to look at how we can work through society, as Marx had said, like our nature comes through with what type of society we live in. So.
Yeah. And it's funny because that's such a glaring contradiction when people make this argument about human nature. A lot of these people also don't believe that we evolved.
Yeah,
They believe that we came out of Noah's Ark, and then they also believe that.
Hobby group.
Yeah, and all my coworkers and my employers, everybody. Yeah. So yes, they believe.
This is the way God made us.
Yeah, 6,500 years.
Oh, wow.
No
Yeah.
questions asked. But at the same time, they also believe that fundamentally, somewhere deep within, we have this desire to just rage, just be animals, so it's okay as far as, there's selfishness and that kind of narrative goes, or human narrative goes, it's okay for us to act like animals, but God forbid you say we evolved from animals.
Right.
So there's a pretty glaring contradiction that we can try to start pointing out.
Having your cake and eating it too.
I think we should close unless somebody else has.
Matt, and Martine,
Okay,
and then
Matt,
you are.
Martine, okay.
So Matt, go ahead.
Yeah,
I
I'll
don't remember.
Yeah, sorry.
Mine was super short if you want to
Yeah,
pick one.
yeah.
So I was just going to pick up because I didn't hear. So when I hear people use the argument, like what you said, socialism is done because human nature, right? So just that. But I think what I think people are saying when they're saying that is people need money to be motivated, right? And I hadn't heard the word motivation so far, but you used the word incentivizing. And that's really getting at what I feel is the crux of the argument that they're making, even though they're not being very eloquent or whatever. They're basically saying that we're only motivated by money and by stuff and by, a reward of some kind. And so it's really, to me, maybe part of that argument would be to try to look for ways that a person can realize that they are motivated by other things other than money themselves,
Yeah, altruism.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and actually, we have a friend that studied he studied evolution and he's studying genetics and he works for Monsanto. And he will tell me with full confidence, I know I'm an expert on this, I have a PhD, and we need leaders. We all need someone, like it's just naturally there's no way that we are able to, sort of distribute work equitably without a hierarchy. He's so sure that there needs to be this leadership and war and all these things. And it's just crazy because this person, I was
Apparently, you got that from looking at the DNA of corn.
he works for
And just one other little point too, in that the weak point that I see in using the argument of primitive culture would be that if I was arguing the other side, I would say, well, there was still tribalism, and then once you went out into a larger and larger group, that's when the competition back then was probably coming into play because there was war back then, and there was all these, right? So that's like another sort of thing that we should be prepared to talk back to. In-group, out-group, so it's all related, right? Yeah.
It's like, it just comes down to bringing out the best in us versus rewarding.
Tribalism is definitely a very easy genetic trigger that we can just sort of, that's the other. I don't like it. There is, you don't want to do the naturalistic fallacy by saying what is natural is good, but it's very natural for that to be, there's good reasons why we would be, if you're a Native American, and you see a bunch of white people coming ashore, and you have this sort of genetic trigger that makes you scared and run away, you tend to live longer because you don't get the disease.
Right.
So there is some evolutionary reason for that, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be useful in a time where we understand what's happening when cultures meet and things like that.
Right.
So our scientific knowledge has overcome our genetic predisposition towards tribalism and xenophobia and things like that.
Right.
And so it's that thing that we need to recognize, the sort of science of it, in the sense that that we have these things, but they're not the only things that we have. We have a lot that we need to.
That's right. Yeah. The real argument is short, but then there's all these other things we should incentivize. So do you remember what you were going to say?
Yeah. So Donald Trump is kind of like a corn on the cob. He's a leader. But anyway.
You can understand Donald Trump by looking
Which, you know what, I think that, yeah, I think that could work.
Former leader in the vegetable world.
They are both sort of orange, you know?
Yeah, right.
And they have weird hair.
Hey.
They're tasty with butter.
They're tasty when boiled.
Here he is.
Not to a vegan.
Oh yeah, so let me just make my point here. I was thinking about how like anybody who has ever had like depression, anxiety, or addiction, or any of these like mental conditions, a lot of times in the treatment of it, they'll always implement something but it is, I think it's generally understood that getting people into groups of people where they can discuss their problems with others, that there's kind of
Cathartic effect.
or yeah, like a
Protecting.
what's the word? Like healing, but not healing. Therapeutic. Therapeutic value of like the social interaction that I think capitalism not only doesn't produce, but it kind of suppresses in a lot of ways. And when I thought of that, it reminded me, my mom got me one Christmas, got me a book, and usually when she gets me a book, I'm like, this is a book, it's called The Moth, and it's a radio show on NPR.
The storytelling.
Yeah, it's short stories that are true.
Yeah.
And it's just all these stories, and there was one I read in there, so I wish I could remember it more in detail, but it was something about like somebody who had suffered from depression like their entire life, and they had problems, and they went somewhere, I want to say it was like some African country, I have no idea which one, but he like went there, I think for work, he did something there, and somehow ended up having really bad depression when he was there, and the way they went about taking care of it was so fascinating. It was like they had all these like ritualistic stuff. Like I remember at one point they put them in a bucket, dumped deer blood all over them. So it was like an entire day. The whole community took the day off and from work and went there to be in this ritual. And I should bring it the next meeting so I can like have you guys read it because I'm not going to do it in the lesson. But there was something in there, the context of like one of those people were describing like when Western people wrote it to try and treat them. You're like, all they do is give us like some medication and put us in a room and talk to us about our problems. And they think this is all like nobody even took the day off from it. You know? And it's really telling about like our society and how we try to deal with things in an individualist kind of way. Give them some medication. We don't have time. You can't have your coworkers take like, oh, take the day off, my friend's depressed, you know, like your boss.
That hurts productivity, and it's way more profitable to isolate us and then try to treat your depression and your isolation by yourself. You buy bullshit that'll just spoils a whole,
And you want to get them back into production.
Right, yeah,
You
right.
don't want them just to be like hanging out in deer blood.
When the farm implement breaks down, you bring it into the shop, you tweak it, you fix it so that it's good enough to get back into the
Right,
field.
yeah.